She was in labor, alone, outside in a storm, and her husband, Chicago's most renowned heart surgeon, was the one who ordered the hospital doors locked in her face. No one stopped. No one helped. Dozens of people walked by, saw her, and turned away. But a sleek black Bentley pulled up in the downpour, and the man who stepped out wasn't an angel. He was the man all of Chicago feared. This is the story of a 20-year debt, of the most cruel betrayal, and of a woman who refused to give up. Like and comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. Watch to the end, because you won't guess the ending. The contractions had been coming every 4 minutes for the past hour, and Naomi Mercer still hadn't made it through the front doors of Mercy General. She stood at the base of the hospital steps with rain driving sideways into her face. One hand braced against the iron railing, the other pressed flat against the enormous swell of her belly. Her coat, a gray wool maternity coat she'd bought secondhand because Adrian had told her she was spending too much, was soaked through to the skin. Her shoes were full of water. Every time lightning split the sky above Lakeshore Drive, the reflection turned the wet pavement white for half a second, and in that half second she could see her own reflection looking up at her from the ground. Swollen, drenched, alone. She had called Adrian 40 minutes ago. He had not picked up. She had called again and again. 7 times in total, standing on the sidewalk outside their building while the storm broke open overhead, waiting for the car service he had promised her 3 months ago was already arranged. The car service that did not exist. She knew that now. She knew a lot of things now that she hadn't known a year ago. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open 6 feet ahead of her. Warm light spilled out into the rain. A security guard, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 30s, wearing the blue uniform of Mercy General's contracted private security, stepped into the opening and looked directly at her. He did not move to help her. He put one hand on the door frame and waited. Naomi climbed the first step. Her left knee buckled and she caught herself on the railing, breath punching out of her in a hard grunt. The contraction peaked somewhere in her lower back and radiated forward with the focused intensity of something being torn apart from the inside. She had read the books. She had attended every prenatal class alone because Adrian was always working, always in surgery, always somewhere that wasn't with her. She knew what active labor felt like. This was it. She climbed the second step. "Ma'am." The guard's voice was flat. Not unkind, just flat, the way a wall is flat. "I need you to stop there." She looked up at him. Rain ran into her eyes. "I'm in labor," she said. "I need to get inside." "I understand that. I need you to hold on a moment." "I can't hold on. My contractions are 4 minutes apart." She heard her own voice and it surprised her. Steady, almost calm. The voice she used in her classroom when a child was about to cry and she needed to keep them from tipping over the edge. She was using her teacher voice on herself. "Please, I need to speak to someone in OB." The guard lifted his radio, said something into it she couldn't hear over the rain and the distant percussion of thunder rolling in off the lake. Then he looked back at her. "I've been informed that you are not to be admitted at this time." The words didn't make sense for a moment. She turned them over, examined them the way you examine a sentence in a foreign language, one word at a time. "Not to be admitted," she repeated. "That's correct. I'm in active labor." "Ma'am, I understand." "Do you?" Her voice cracked on the second word and she hated it, hated that it cracked, because she had promised herself she was done with that, done being soft in front of people who had already decided she didn't matter. "I am 8 months pregnant. I am standing in a thunderstorm. I am having a baby right now and you are telling me I cannot come inside." "I've been instructed." "By who?" Silence. The guard looked past her left shoulder. Not evasion, something else. Guilt, maybe. The specific guilt of a man who knows what he's doing is wrong and has decided to do it anyway because someone with authority over him has made the calculus simple. Follow the order or lose the job. "Please," Naomi said. She was not above begging. She had a daughter inside her. "Please, I just need—" Another contraction came, and this one was different. This one had a gravity to it that the others hadn't. She doubled over the railing with both hands, head down, eyes shut, rain hammering the back of her neck. She was aware distantly that she had made some kind of sound. Not a scream. Something lower. something that came from a place below language. Behind her on the sidewalk, she heard footsteps, people passing, people hurrying past in the rain, and not one pair of them slowed down. When she straightened up, the guard was still in the doorway. His radio crackled. He listened to it. His jaw tightened by about 2 millimeters. "I'm sorry," he said. And she believed him, which was almost worse. "I can call you a cab." "A cab?" She laughed. The sound of it frightened her a little. "You're going to call me a cab?" She turned away from him because she couldn't look at his face anymore, and because she needed to think, and she could not think while looking at someone who was sorry. Sorry didn't help. Sorry was the noise people made when they had already decided not to move. She pulled her phone out of her coat pocket with wet, shaking hands. The screen was fogged, and when she unlocked it, she had to wipe it against her coat to read it. She tried Adrian again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She tried the hospital's main line and was put on hold with classical music playing, something bright and strings heavy that felt like a specific variety of cruelty. She looked at the street. The rain was coming down hard enough now that the streetlights had halos around them, thick yellow rings that blurred in the downpour. A delivery truck moved slowly through the intersection at the corner. 2 women in scrubs ran past her on the sidewalk with their jackets held over their heads, laughing at the rain, not seeing her at all. Or seeing her and choosing the size of the laugh over the size of what they were seeing. Naomi sat down on the hospital steps. She did not decide to sit down. Her body decided, and she followed. She put her back against the iron railing, stretched her legs out in front of her on the wet concrete, and pressed both hands against her belly and breathed. In through the nose, slow. Out through the mouth, slower. Her daughter moved inside her. A rolling push against the inside of her ribs, deliberate, almost impatient, as if the baby knew something was wrong and was running out of patience with the situation. "I know," Naomi said softly. "I know. I'm working on it." The guard had retreated back inside the doors. She could see him through the glass, talking on his radio, not looking at her. Through the lobby behind him, she could see the warm, normal machinery of a hospital evening. Nurses crossing the corridor with tablets, a janitor pushing a cart, an elderly man in a wheelchair being steered toward an elevator. Normal. Warm. 14 steps away. She tried to think through the options. There was a hospital 3 miles north, St. Catherine's, that she'd toured in her second trimester. She had been planning to give birth there anyway, before Adrian had insisted on Mercy General because he had privileges here, because it would be better for optics, because it mattered what the other physicians saw. She had given in because she'd been tired of fighting about things that didn't seem worth the cost of the fight, not knowing that the fight was always worth it, that the moment you stopped fighting was the moment someone with no intention of stopping took the ground you'd just given up. She started to type the address for St. Catherine's into her Maps app. Her fingers were too wet and cold to hit the right keys. She deleted and tried again. The contraction that hit her this time made her drop the phone. It clattered down 2 steps and landed face up, screen still lit, rain spattering across it. She watched it from where she sat, unable to move for the duration of the contraction, which lasted, she counted, 48 seconds. When it passed, she reached forward and picked it up. The screen had cracked in one corner. She wiped it again. Still worked. She didn't notice the car until its headlights swept across her. A Bentley Mulsanne, black, moving slowly through the storm with the particular unhurried confidence of a vehicle that doesn't worry about weather or traffic or what anyone else on the road is doing. It pulled to the curb in the ambulance bay 20 feet to her left, technically illegal, clearly not a concern, and stopped. The engine did not turn off. Through the rain-blurred glass of the driver's side window, she could see a figure. Then the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall. That was the first thing. Not imposingly tall, but tall enough that she recalibrated her sense of the space around him. 40, maybe 42, in a charcoal overcoat that the rain immediately began to darken at the shoulders. Dark hair with gray at the temples. A face that had been handsome a long time and was still handsome in the way that things are handsome when they've earned it through duration rather than luck. He stood in the rain without hunching against it, without any visible irritation at being wet, and looked at her. Not through her, at her. The passenger door opened and a small, elderly woman emerged, moving carefully, holding a large umbrella that the wind immediately inverted. The man said something to her in Italian that Naomi couldn't catch over the rain and reached out one arm to keep the woman steady. The old woman patted his arm and said something back and pointed at Naomi with her free hand. The man looked at Naomi again. He crossed the 20 feet between them in 7 or 8 seconds, not running, just walking fast, and crouched down in front of her on the wet steps so that his eyes were level with hers. Up close, he was something other than what he'd looked like from a distance. The face was more complicated. Not softer, harder in places, with the particular hardness of someone who had made a long series of decisions and was at peace with all of them. But the eyes were something she hadn't expected. "How far apart?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like someone requesting data. 4 minutes, she said. Maybe 3 now. He looked at the hospital doors. The security guard was watching from inside the glass. The man held eye contact with the guard for a moment, just a moment, and she saw the guard step back, literally take 1 step backward, away from the glass. "They won't let me in," she said. "I don't know." She stopped. She was not going to explain Adrian to a stranger in the rain. "There's been some kind of... I need to get to St. Catherine's. That's 25 minutes in this weather." He stood. "Can you walk?" "I was walking fine a few minutes ago." He reached down and she took his hand without deciding to, and he pulled her to her feet with a steadiness that suggested he had done things requiring steadiness before. The elderly woman had made her way over with her ruined umbrella and put one hand on Naomi's arm and said something warm in Italian, and looked at her with the particular ferocity of a woman who has seen worse and survived it. "My aunt," the man said. "She says you're going to be fine." "She doesn't know that." "No," he agreed, "but she's right anyway." He walked her to the car. She didn't argue. There was a version of her, the version that existed 4 contractions ago, that would have argued, that would have stood on principle in stranger danger and the specific dignity of not accepting help from a man whose name she didn't know and whose car cost more than her annual salary. That version of her was still there, watching from somewhere internal, arms folded, jaw set. But the version of her that was here, on these steps, in this rain, with her daughter pressing against her ribs in a way that meant now, that version got in the car. The interior was warm, dark leather, some kind of wood paneling, a faint smell she couldn't identify, cedar maybe, or something close to it. The old woman got in beside her and produced from somewhere a folded blanket that she draped over Naomi's lap with a kind of authoritative tenderness that reminded her, painfully, of her own grandmother. The man got into the driver's seat. He had already taken out his phone. "Marco?" His voice when he was on the phone was different from his voice on the steps. Quieter, harder, like the difference between the surface of water and what's underneath it. "I need Reyes at the house in 40 minutes. Full setup." A pause. "No, not a drill. Bring everything." He ended the call and immediately made another. "Elena, my estate. Now." Shorter pause. "Because I said now." Naomi watched his profile in the rearview mirror. "Who's Reyes?" "My physician." "You have a personal physician?" "Yes." "Who makes house calls in the middle of the night?" "When I ask him to." She looked out the window. The hospital slid past, its lights receding in the rain. The security guard was a blue smear behind glass, gone in 3 seconds. She felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief. Something in between, the specific emotion that lives in the space between what you thought your life was going to be and what it actually turned out to be. "My name is Naomi," she said. A beat. "Dante." She waited. No last name. She didn't push. Another contraction came as they merged onto the expressway, and she grabbed the door handle and breathed through it with her eyes fixed on the city lights streaming past in the rain-blurred window. The old woman, Dante's aunt, placed one small dry hand over Naomi's and held it without speaking, and the grip was firm enough to be real and quiet enough not to demand anything in return. Naomi held on. The estate was 30 minutes north of the city proper, behind a gate that opened without Dante slowing down, up a gravel drive lined with old oaks whose branches moved in the storm like something agitated and enormous. The house itself was all stone and dark glass, set back from the lake, lights coming on room by room as the car approached as if the building were waking up. A man was already waiting at the front door with a bag. Mid-50s, compact, quick-moving, the demeanor of someone who has been jolted awake in the middle of the night before and has long since made his peace with it. He looked at Naomi the way doctors look at patients when they're assessing rather than greeting, efficient, clinical, information gathering. "Reyes," Dante said. "I see her. How far apart?" 3 minutes, Naomi said. "Maybe 2.5. Reyes looked at Dante. Something passed between them that she wasn't supposed to understand. "Get her inside." The next 4 hours existed for Naomi as a series of images rather than a continuous experience, the way extreme physical events compress and expand time simultaneously. The room they brought her to was large and warm, converted in what seemed like minutes into something functional. A bed with protective covering, a rolling tray with instruments, a lamp repositioned for light. Reyes worked with a woman named Elena, who appeared from somewhere inside the house, and turned out to be a labor and delivery nurse who had apparently worked at Northwestern for 12 years before Dante had found some reason to have her on his private payroll. Naomi did not ask what that reason was. She was busy. At some point, she was aware that the storm had intensified. She could hear it against the windows, the lake throwing itself against the shore somewhere below the grounds, rain hitting the glass in irregular bursts, like something trying to get in. At some point, she was aware that Dante was no longer in the room, that he had stood in the doorway for the first hour and then quietly stepped out, and that his absence felt different from the usual absence of men in moments like this. Not abandonment, something more like respect for a door that wasn't his to walk through. His aunt stayed. She held Naomi's hand for hours. She told stories in Italian, and Naomi understood none of them, but the cadence was right. The rhythm of the voice was the rhythm you use when you're trying to keep someone tethered to the present moment, to this breath, and then the next one. Her daughter was born at 2:17 in the morning, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Perfect fingers. Perfect fury. She came out angry, announcing herself, none of the stunned silence Naomi had worried about. Reyes placed her on Naomi's chest within seconds, and Naomi looked down at this face she had never seen and felt the bottom drop out of whatever had been holding her upright for the past 8 months. She cried. She was not ashamed of it. She pressed her daughter against her chest and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in a long time. Not the controlled private crying she did in the school bathroom during her prep period. Not the careful crying she'd learned to do without making noise so Adrian wouldn't comment on it in the morning. Real crying, the kind that clears something out. The room gradually quieted. Reyes wrote something in a small notebook. Elena cleaned up with the brisk efficiency of someone who has seen the sacred become ordinary and found the ordinary sacred in return. Dante's aunt sat in a chair by the window and did not try to fill the silence with words. At some point, Dante appeared in the doorway again. He didn't come in. He stood at the threshold, one hand on the frame, and looked at Naomi and the baby with an expression she couldn't fully read from across the room. Not tender exactly, not detached. Something between those things. The expression of a man who has just witnessed something he was not prepared to witness. "She's healthy," Reyes said without looking up from his notebook. "Both of them." Dante nodded once. He looked at Naomi. "You need anything?" "No." She paused. "Yes." She paused again. "Why did you stop?" He considered the question as if he were examining it for structural weaknesses. "My aunt saw you," he said finally. "She told me to stop." "And you always do what your aunt says?" Something that wasn't quite a smile. "I try not to argue with her." Naomi looked down at her daughter. The baby had her eyes open, dark, unfocused, aimed at nothing and everything. "I need to call someone," she said. "A lawyer. I need—" The sentence broke apart because there were too many things at the end of it, and she didn't know which one to grab first. She needed a lawyer. She needed a place to stay. She needed to file for divorce. She needed to make sure Adrian couldn't take her daughter. She needed about 40 things simultaneously, and she was 2 hours postpartum and hadn't slept in more than 30 hours, and her body felt like the aftermath of a very small earthquake. "Tomorrow," Dante said. "I can't wait until—" "You can." His voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way that things are firm when they've decided. "Tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we deal with the rest." She wanted to argue. She looked down at her daughter instead. The baby's hand had found her finger in the dark. 5 perfect fingers closing around one of hers, a grip that was unreasonably strong, a grip that said, "I am here, and I am not letting go." Naomi exhaled. She did not sleep for another hour. She lay in the large, quiet room and listened to the storm ease and listened to her daughter breathe and tried to build a map of what came next, what the first move was, how you start the process of dismantling a life that had been built around you like a cage. She thought about the hospital steps. She thought about the security guard's face. She thought about Adrian's voice the last time she'd tried to tell him she was scared. The way he'd tilted his head at her with that particular expression of pity sharpened to a point, as if her fear were a symptom of a larger stupidity. She thought about the locket at her throat. She had worn it so long she forgot it was there most of the time. An antique piece, silver, tarnished at the hinge, with a small engraved pattern on the front that she'd never been able to fully identify. Flowers, or leaves, or something older than either. Her grandmother had given it to her the summer before she died, pressed it into her hand without preamble, and said only, "That belongs to someone who knows how to keep going." Naomi had assumed she meant herself. Her grandmother had been prone to that kind of faith. She didn't notice the moment she fell asleep. She didn't notice either the moment Dante came back to the doorway, just once, briefly, on his way to another part of the house, and stopped. His eyes went to the locket. He stood absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then he walked away and stood at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the lake, which was still churning in the aftermath of the storm. His jaw was locked. His hands were at his sides and perfectly still, which was how you could tell they wanted to move. He had spent 20 years looking for something, and it had arrived at his gate in a thunderstorm. In the morning, when Naomi woke with her daughter warm and sleeping against her chest, she would find a phone on the nightstand beside her. New, charged, contacts already loaded, and a note in handwriting that was angular and precise. "Lawyer's name is Carol. She knows to expect your call. You are not alone in this." She would read the note twice. She would look at the ceiling of a room she didn't recognize in a house that belonged to a man she didn't know. And she would think, "He's not done yet." She was right. What she didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that 12 miles south, in a corner office on the 14th floor of Mercy General, Adrian Voss was on the phone with his attorney at 6 in the morning, voice low and controlled, already moving, already building the case that would paint his wife as mentally unstable, emotionally volatile, a danger to herself and her child, already naming witnesses, already describing the night in terms that had nothing to do with what had actually happened, and his attorney was taking notes. The phone was on the nightstand when Naomi woke up. She stared at it for a long moment before she moved, because moving meant the night before was real, and for approximately 4 seconds after waking, she had existed in the brief, merciful suspension between sleep and consciousness where nothing has happened yet. Her daughter's weight against her chest ended that. 7 pounds, 2 ounces of warm, breathing reality, and the night before came back in pieces. The rain, the steps, the security guard's face, the car, the man in the doorway. She picked up the note first. Read it twice. Set it down. Then she looked at her daughter, who was awake and examining the ceiling with the focused concentration of someone encountering a ceiling for the first time and finding it worthy of serious consideration. "Okay," Naomi said softly. "Okay." She didn't know who she was talking to. The room in daylight was different from the room at 2 a.m., larger somehow, or at least more itself. Stone walls, actual stone, not drywall pretending to be something else. A window that ran nearly floor to ceiling and looked out over a lawn that sloped down toward the lake, which this morning was flat and silver gray. The storm scrubbed clean out of the sky. Everything washed and quiet. The grounds were immaculate in the way that things are immaculate when someone is paid to make them that way. Not the forced perfection of a showroom, but the functional order of a place that is used and maintained and taken seriously. She sat up carefully, one arm around her daughter, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her body reported back with a comprehensive list of grievances. She ignored most of them. There was a knock at the door. 2 knocks, actually, the second one lighter, as if the person on the other side had reconsidered the volume of the first. "Come in." Elena opened the door 6 inches and looked through the gap. In daylight, she was somewhere in her late 40s, brown-skinned, hair pulled back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who does not have time for hair. She was carrying a tray with coffee and what appeared to be actual food: eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice, and she moved into the room with the practiced quiet of someone who understands that new mothers exist in a particular kind of fragility that is not weakness, but is still fragility. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Like I gave birth on someone's guest bed during a thunderstorm." Elena almost smiled. "Dr. Reyes wants to check you both this morning. When you're ready." "I'm ready now." "Eat first." It was not a suggestion. Naomi ate. The coffee was very good, the kind of good that tells you something about the household it comes from, that tells you quality here is not an effort, but a baseline. She drank it looking out at the lake and held her daughter in her left arm and tried to build the first 10 steps of what came next. Carol, the lawyer. She needed to call Carol. She needed to establish that she and her daughter had a residence, that she wasn't, what was the word Adrian would use, transient, unstable. She needed to get ahead of whatever he was already doing, because he was doing something. She knew that the way she knew the lake was cold, not from having touched it, but from proximity, from being close enough long enough to understand the temperature of the thing. She reached for the phone. Carol picked up on the second ring. A woman's voice, no nonsense, Chicago flat vowels. "This is Carol. My name is Naomi Mercer. I was told, I know who you are. I've been waiting for your call since 6 this morning." A beat. "Your husband filed an emergency motion at 7:45, petition for sole custody, citing concerns about maternal mental fitness and the welfare of the child." The orange juice glass was still in Naomi's hand. She set it down with exaggerated care. "He filed already." "He filed before you were awake." Carol's voice had the specific flatness of someone delivering bad news with precision rather than sympathy, which Naomi found, surprisingly, more useful than the alternative. "I need to know where you are, and I need to know everything about last night. Everything. Start from when labor began." Naomi talked for 22 minutes. Carol interrupted twice, once to ask a specific question about the security guard's name, which Naomi didn't know, and once to ask how many people had witnessed the scene on the hospital steps. When Naomi finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be deliberate. "Okay," Carol said, "here's where we are. He has a head start, and he's using it. He's also a physician with a spotless public record and more professional allies in this city than you can count. What he doesn't have," another pause, "is the truth, which means we need to find every witness, every camera, every piece of evidence that shows what actually happened last night." "The hospital has cameras." "The hospital has cameras that belong to the hospital, and right now the hospital is administratively aligned with your husband. Getting that footage is going to take a court order in time we may not have." Naomi looked at her daughter. Her daughter had fallen asleep again, one fist pressed against her cheek, unaware of the machinery being assembled around her small life. "What do I do first?" "Stay where you are. Don't go home. Do not make contact with your husband for any reason. And Ms. Mercer," Carol's voice dropped by about half a register, "who exactly is Dante Moretti to you?" The name hung in the air. "He's the person who took me to the hospital when I couldn't get in," Naomi said carefully. "I know what he did last night. I'm asking what he is to you." "I met him 4 hours before I gave birth." A long silence. "His people called me. He's the one who arranged this consultation." "I know." "Do you know who he is? What he does?" "I have a general sense." "Miss Mercer." Carol's voice was not unkind, but it was very clear. "General sense isn't going to be enough. If your husband's attorneys find out you spent the night in Dante Moretti's house, that you gave birth there, so they will use that. They will build an entire narrative around it, and they will not need much to do it convincingly. Naomi's jaw tightened. I was locked out of a hospital in active labor. I know that. I didn't have a choice. I know that too. I'm just telling you what they'll do with it. A pause. I'll be there by 11. Don't talk to anyone else until I arrive. The call ended. Naomi sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, then set it down and looked out at the lake. She was still looking at it when the door opened without a knock. Not Elena. Not Reyes. Dante. He stopped just inside the doorway, which seemed to be his preferred position relative to this room. Threshold, not commitment. He was dressed for the day. Dark slacks, a gray shirt, no tie, the sleeves rolled to the elbow in the manner of someone who has been working since early morning. There was coffee in his hand, but it looked untouched. Carol called you? Naomi asked. She called my office. He looked at the baby. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened, exactly, but rearranged. How is she? Perfect. They always say that, and it's usually just something people say, but in this case, I think it's actually true. He crossed the room to the window. Not to her. To the window, standing 6 feet away, looking out at the lake. His profile in morning light was different from the night before. The storm had made everything dramatic. Daylight made everything just what it was. You should know, he said, that your husband called the house. Naomi went very still. This morning, Dante continued, 6:22. He was given this number by a brief pause that told her something. Someone who should not have given it. What did he say? He said he wanted to speak to his wife. Dante's voice was neutral. The neutrality of a man who has had practice keeping things level. He was told you weren't available. And? He said to tell you that whatever you were thinking, you were making a mistake. That the best thing for... Dante's jaw moved slightly. The baby was for you to come home. Naomi exhaled through her nose. She knew that sentence. She knew the exact intonation Adrian would have used, the specific register of concern that was really a threat dressed in the clothes of reasonableness. She had heard it approximately 300 times in the last 2 years. He's trying to make this look like a kidnapping, she said. I know. His attorneys are going to say I'm unstable, that I'm with a man with criminal ties, that I know what his attorneys are going to say. She looked at him. He was still looking at the lake. Does that concern you? He turned from the window. In direct light, his eyes were darker than she'd registered in the rain. Not black, but very dark brown, the color of something that doesn't reflect much. Ms. Mercer. Naomi. A short pause. Naomi. My involvement in this is a separate matter. What concerns me is that you have a lawyer and that she's good, which she is, and that you understand the next 72 hours are the ones that will define the rest of this case. I understand that. Good. He moved toward the door, then stopped, half-turned. My aunt is making lunch. She insists on it. She'll take it personally if you don't come down. Is your aunt always this? Yes, he said. Always. And he was gone. Reyes came at 9 and examined Naomi and the baby with the thoroughness of someone who does not cut corners and the economy of someone who doesn't waste time with reassurance before he's earned it. Both of them were healthy. The baby, who did not yet have a name, because Naomi had been saving the naming for after the birth, and now the naming felt like an act she needed to do alone, deliberately, without Adrian's fingerprints on it, was perfect, as advertised. Reyes gave her a list of instructions in the manner of someone who expects the list to be followed and left without small talk, which she respected. Carol arrived at 11:04. She was shorter than her voice suggested, mid-40s, a compact woman in a charcoal suit that had seen a lot of courtrooms and looked like it, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a bag that was less a briefcase than a portable filing system. She shook Naomi's hand with the grip of someone who doesn't perform warmth, set her bag on the table by the window, and began. Walk me through the marriage, she said. Not the feelings, the facts, timeline, incidents, anything documented. They worked for 2 hours. Naomi talked and Carol took notes with a mechanical precision that was almost soothing, the sense that everything she said was being caught, cataloged, made into something that could stand up to scrutiny. She talked about the last 18 months, the way Adrian's behavior had changed after his promotion to department head, the slow replacement of one version of him with another, the night she'd found the email from Claire Hartwell, the hospital's chief administrator, and confronted him, and the conversation that followed, which had not been a denial. Just a different kind of attack. You're imagining things. You're paranoid. You need to talk to someone. I'm worried about you. He started documenting things about 6 months ago, Naomi said. I didn't realize it at the time. Little things. He'd write notes in his phone. I saw them once by accident, descriptions of things I'd said or done, framed a certain way. I thought he was venting. I think now he was building a file. Carol nodded without looking up from her notepad. That's consistent with what we're seeing in the emergency motion. Several of the exhibits he's attached are dated going back 8 months. She paused. Miss Mercer, did you at any point seek mental health treatment during the marriage? Naomi knew why she was asking. I saw a therapist for 4 months. She referred me to a psychiatrist who I saw twice. I stopped going because my husband told the psychiatrist I was exaggerating my symptoms for attention, and the psychiatrist mentioned this to me in a way that I found... She stopped, started again. I was not imagining my symptoms. I know that. Carol's voice was level. He's going to use both of those visits. He's already named both providers in the motion. She looked up, which means we need to get ahead of the narrative before it sets. From somewhere in the house, Dante's aunt was audible. A low stream of Italian, the clink of things in a kitchen, a sound that was almost aggressively domestic against the backdrop of what was being assembled in this room. There's something else, Naomi said. Carol waited. Last night, at the hospital, there were cameras, so it's not just the hospital cameras. I remember seeing a bank camera on the building across the street, and there's a parking structure on the north side of the lot. I've walked past it 100 times. It has cameras on every level pointed at the entrance. Carol was already writing. I'll need the intersection. Lakeshore and Mercy Drive, northeast corner. Good. Carol paused her pen. And the security guard, even if we don't have his name, someone gave him that order. Someone in that building, last night, with authority, made a decision to deny emergency medical care to a woman in active labor. That person is potentially facing criminal liability, which means when they realize what's coming, they may be more interested in cooperation than loyalty. Naomi looked at her hands. Adrian won't break, she said. I've been watching him stay composed in situations that would wreck most people. It's actually... She stopped. It's actually what I loved about him. At the beginning, the ability to stay calm. I didn't understand then that it's not the same thing as being good. Carol looked at her for a moment. Not the assessing look she'd been using. Something different. Something that acknowledged what Naomi had just said in the same way you acknowledge someone who has been carrying a heavy thing. Then she put her glasses on and went back to her notes. By the time Carol left at 2 in the afternoon, they had the outline of a response to the emergency motion, a list of 12 witnesses Carol's investigator would contact before the end of the week, and a preliminary injunction request that would, if granted, freeze any legal proceedings related to the baby until Naomi could establish stable residence and demonstrate parental fitness. What they did not have was the security footage from the hospital entrance. What they did not have was a witness who would go on the record. What they did not have was anything that could compete in the short term with a physician's word. Naomi stood at the window after Carol left and watched the lake and held her daughter and thought about that. She was still standing there when Dante came to the doorway again. This was becoming a pattern. Him in the doorway, her by the window, the room between them holding whatever the conversation was going to be. Carol brief you? She asked without turning around. She updated me. And? He came into the room this time, actually into it, crossing to the other window, standing 6 feet away, looking at the same water she was looking at. His aunt was beside him. She had materialized as she tended to, without apparent transit, simply appearing in spaces when the situation called for her. She was looking at Naomi's daughter with an expression that was proprietary in the most gentle possible way. He's very good, Dante said. Not generous, not admiring, just precise. The way you're precise about the properties of a problem you're working on. He picked the timing carefully. Emergency motion before you were awake, before you had counsel. He knows the system. He's been in that hospital for 11 years, Naomi said. He knows every administrator, every department head, every person whose signature he needs. Yes. A pause. Which is useful information, actually. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was looking at the baby. What does that mean? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. His aunt said something in Italian. He replied in Italian. A brief exchange, not an argument, more like the compression of an argument that had already happened and been concluded before this moment. It means, he said finally, that people who know a system well also know where it's vulnerable. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one. He looked at her now, directly, without the slight deflection she'd noticed in him, the way he tended to address a point slightly adjacent to the one being discussed. This was the first time he'd looked at her without that. I want to help you. You've already helped me. More than I have. She held his gaze. Why? The question sat there. He didn't dodge it, which she had half expected. He stood with it for a moment, like a man standing in a doorway deciding whether to step through. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Not today. When you're... He looked at the baby. When there's time to tell it properly. You can tell me now. No. And the way he said it was not dismissive. It was the tone of someone protecting the weight of a thing, keeping it from being said wrong. Not now, but soon. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at her daughter. The baby had her eyes open again, that unfocused dark gaze aimed at the ceiling, at the light, at whatever it is that infants look at when they seem to be looking at everything. Okay, she said. Soon. That evening, Naomi sat in the large kitchen with Dante's aunt, whose name she had finally learned through Elena was Rosa, and watched Rosa make something complicated and pasta-based that required multiple pots and a great deal of commentary in Italian, none of which Naomi understood, but all of which she found, obscurely, stabilizing. There was a television on the wall, the news, and she was not watching it until she was. Adrian's face appeared on the screen. It was a press statement. He was standing outside Mercy General in his white coat, of course the white coat, with the composed expression of a man who has mastered the performance of concern. He spoke about his wife. He used the word distressed. He used the phrase in need of support. He said, looking directly into the camera with the eyes that had once made her feel chosen and now made her feel the particular nausea of having trusted the wrong thing, that he was deeply worried and that all he wanted was the safe return of his daughter. Rosa turned the television off with the decisive snap of a woman who has made a decision and that's final. She said something in Italian that was short and sharp and clearly anatomical in its reference, and set a bowl of pasta in front of Naomi with the emphasis of someone making a statement. Naomi stared at the blank screen for another few seconds. Then she picked up the fork. She was going to need every calorie. Because the next morning, at 7:58, Carol called with something that changed the shape of everything. I have a problem, Carol said. Her voice was tight in a way it hadn't been the day before. Controlled, but tight, like a cable under tension. Judge Whitmore reviewed the emergency motion last night. He's granted a temporary order. Naomi's stomach dropped 6 inches. What kind of order? Temporary restriction on travel with the minor child pending the full hearing. You cannot leave the state. You cannot transfer the baby's physical custody. And... Carol paused, and in the pause, Naomi heard the thing coming before it arrived. He's ordered a home evaluation. A court-appointed assessor will visit your current residence within 72 hours to determine whether the environment is suitable. Naomi looked around the kitchen. The stone walls, the multiple pots. Rosa, who was watching her with the focused attention of someone who understands bad news even in a language she doesn't speak. My current residence, Naomi said, is Dante Moretti's house. Yes. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. That's going to be a problem, Naomi said. It's manageable, Carol said, which was what lawyers said when something was a problem but not yet a catastrophe. I need you to understand something, though. If the assessor comes to that house and identifies it as the home of someone with Mr. Moretti's profile, Adrian's attorneys are going to pivot the entire case. They're not going to argue that you're unfit anymore. They're going to argue that you voluntarily placed your infant daughter in a dangerous environment. That's a different case, a harder one. Naomi pressed her knuckles against the table, hard enough to feel the stone underneath the wood. I was locked out of a hospital. I know. I didn't have a choice about where I went. I know that too, but choice is going to be hard to establish when the alternative narrative is this convenient. Carol exhaled. I need you to find somewhere else to go in the next 48 hours. A friend, family, anyone whose address won't become a story. Naomi went through her list. Her parents were in Phoenix, her mother recovering from hip surgery, her father overwhelmed and not equipped for this. Her closest friend from college had moved to Seattle 2 years ago. Her friends in Chicago, the ones that remained after 2 years of Adrian quietly, efficiently managing her social world until it was small enough to fit in his hand, were people she had not spoken to since well before the pregnancy, people who, if she called now, she would have to explain too much to before she could ask for anything. She had let her life get very small. She had not understood, until this moment, sitting in someone else's kitchen with a 3-day-old daughter and nowhere to go, exactly how small it had gotten. I'll figure it out, she said. 48 hours. I heard you. She hung up, set the phone face down on the table, looked at her hands. Rosa put a cup of coffee in front of her, then sat down across from her. Not beside her, across, in the manner of someone who intends to be looked at. She said something in Italian, short, direct, the specific cadence of a sentence that doesn't require translation. I don't speak Italian, Naomi said. Rosa pointed at the phone, then at Naomi, then at the ceiling, upward, which Naomi interpreted as meaning the rest of the house, the man somewhere in it. She said the sentence again. Tell him, Naomi guessed. Rosa pointed at her, tapped the table twice. Tell him now. Rosa nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who has been understood. Naomi found Dante in a room she hadn't been in before. A study, or something that functioned as one, at the back of the house overlooking the lake. 2 of his people were with him, a man she didn't know, broad, standing near the door with the very specific stillness of someone whose job involves being ready, and Marco, whom she recognized from the name Dante had used on the phone in the car. They were looking at something on a laptop. All 3 of them registered her arrival in the doorway. The bodyguard by reflex, Marco by quick sideways glance, Dante by stopping whatever he was saying and waiting. I need to talk to you, she said. Marco looked at Dante. Dante looked at Marco. Give us a minute, he said. Marco and the other man left with the uncomplicated compliance of people who are used to the instruction and don't waste energy on the feeling about it. Naomi told him about the court order, about the home evaluation, about Carol's 72-hour window. She told it quickly, without preamble, because she had learned in the last 48 hours that preamble with this man was unnecessary. He processed information at the rate it was delivered and did not need time bought for him by softening. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup 1 full rotation on the desk with 2 fingers. Then, "You could stay." She blinked. "You heard what I just said." "I heard you. If the evaluator comes here, I know what happens if the evaluator comes here." He said it without defensiveness, just clarity. "I'm telling you that you could stay anyway." That's... She stopped, looked at him. "That's a significant risk." "For you, yes." He paused. "Not for me." She studied his face, the thing she had not been able to read in him, the specific quality that lived behind the directness, that made her unable to fully predict what he would say next, was more visible here, in this room, in daylight, than it had been anywhere else. It was not warmth exactly, not coldness either. It was something that had been made out of both, and was now neither. Something refined by a long time and a lot of decisions into its own distinct thing. "Why?" she asked. And she wasn't asking about the logistics. He looked at her for a long moment, Then he reached into the desk drawer and took something out and set it on the desk in front of her. A photograph. Old. Printed on paper that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. The color a little bleached the way photographs went before the digital era made everything permanent. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing outside what looked like a diner, squinting against the sun, laughing at something off camera, dark-haired, pretty in the unguarded way of someone who doesn't know they're being photographed. "My sister," Dante said. "Kara, 22 years ago." Naomi looked at the photograph, then at him. "What happened to her?" "She was attacked," he said. His voice was level. The levelness of a thing that has been said before, that has been processed until it no longer catches, but the effort of the processing is still audible underneath. "On her way home from work. 3 men. She survived because—" He stopped. "She survived because a woman she had never met refused to walk past." Naomi was very still. The woman stayed with her, kept the men from coming back, called for help, stayed until the police came, and then stayed after that, until Kara was stable. She refused to give her name. Before she left, Kara pressed something into her hand. He paused. The only thing she had with her, she didn't have money or jewelry. She had a locket she wore around her neck. She pressed it into this woman's hand and said, he looked at the photograph. She said, "This is all I have, but I want you to have it." The silence in the room was very complete. Naomi's hand went, without decision, to her throat, to the locket. Dante watched her hand move there. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She felt the small silver weight under her fingers, the familiar weight she had stopped feeling years ago because it had become part of her body, part of the landscape of herself. The tarnished hinge, the pattern on the front she had never been able to fully identify. "My grandmother," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "What was her name?" Naomi looked at him. Vera Ashworth." Something moved through his face, fast, controlled, but there. The specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a long time to hear a particular name and is now hearing it and is managing what that does to him with everything he has. "Vera Ashworth," he said, very quietly. "She told Kara her name was Vera." The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, the lake moved against the shore in its slow, continuous way, indifferent to the weight of what was being assembled in this room. A debt 22 years old, a locket that had traveled through generations without knowing what it carried, a woman who had arrived in a thunderstorm not knowing she had come home to something. Naomi's eyes burned. She did not let them go further than that. Not here. Not yet. "She never told me," Naomi said. "No." He paused. "People who do things for the right reasons usually don't." She looked at him across the desk. "So this isn't about me." "It started as a debt," he said. "Whether it's still only that—" He stopped. The first time she had seen him stop himself. "That's a different question." She let that sit. She looked at the photograph, at the young woman laughing at something off camera, unaware that 22 years later the chain of events set in motion on her behalf would end up here, in this room, with a woman holding a locket that had traveled in a circle. "I'm staying," Naomi said. He looked at her. The assessment, the court order, whatever Adrian's attorneys are going to do with it. "I'm not going to make decisions out of fear. I did that for 2 years, and look where it got me." She set her hand flat on the desk. "I'm staying, and you're going to tell me everything about what you're already doing, because I know you're doing something, and I am not going to be a person things happen to anymore." The quiet in the room changed quality. Dante looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing she had seen to something unguarded in his face, something that existed before the management of it. Then he reached forward, turned the laptop so she could see the screen, and began to talk. On the screen were files, documents, records, surveillance logs from the night of the storm, camera angles she hadn't known existed, a phone record from a call made at 9:47 p.m. from a Mercy General Administrator's extension to Adrian Voss's private cell, 43 minutes before she had arrived at the hospital entrance. Someone had made a call. Someone had warned him she was coming, and Dante had already found out. The phone record was a single line on the screen. One call. 9:47 p.m., 12 minutes long, from the direct extension of Claire Hartwell, Chief Administrator, Mercy General Hospital, to Adrian Voss's private cell phone. 43 minutes before Naomi had arrived at the entrance. 43 minutes of preparation time. Enough time to brief security. Enough time to position the story. Naomi stared at the number on the screen until it stopped being a number and became something else. The shape of a decision someone had made about her life while she was in her apartment timing contractions and trying to reach her husband. "He knew I was coming," she said. "He knew before you left your building." Dante pulled the laptop back toward him and scrolled. "There's a second call, 10:14. Same extension, same number, 4 minutes. That one was made after you arrived at the entrance. A status update." "That's what it looks like." She sat back in the chair. The study was quiet except for the lake outside and the distant sound of Rosa in the kitchen and the very specific silence that lives inside the space between learning something and knowing what to do with it. "How did you get these?" Dante looked at her steadily. "You don't need the specifics of that." "I think I do." "Well, you think you do," he said, "but what you actually need is the result. The specifics create exposure for you. I'm not a liability you need to manage." "No." He said it without pause. "You're not. But you are a person whose attorney needs to be able to say, in court, under oath, that her client had no knowledge of how certain information was obtained." He closed the laptop. "So I'm going to keep you at a distance from the how. The what. The what you can know." She wanted to push. She looked at his face and understood that pushing on this particular thing would cost her more than the information was worth, and filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she would return to when she had more leverage. "What else?" she said. He opened the laptop again. A different file. A scanned document, internal formatting, Mercy General header at the top. A psychiatric evaluation, filed with the court as Exhibit C in Adrian's emergency motion, dated 6 weeks ago, signed by a Dr. Philip Okafor, staff psychiatrist at Mercy General. Naomi leaned forward. The document was 3 pages. She read the first paragraph and her vision went slightly white at the edges. Not from emotion, or not only from emotion, but from the specific neurological response to reading your own name attached to a clinical description of a person you do not recognize. Paranoid ideation, emotional dysregulation, delusional episodes characterized by unfounded accusations toward the patient's spouse, potential risk to self and others. "I saw Okafor twice," she said. Her voice was very quiet. 8 months ago. Adrian referred me to him. I went because..." She stopped. "Because she had been scared and tired, and Adrian had framed the referral as concern, and she had wanted, badly, to believe the concern was real. I went twice. The second visit he told me Adrian had called him. He said Adrian was worried. I never went back." "This evaluation is dated 6 weeks ago," Dante said. "You were not present for it." She looked at the date. November 14th. She had not been in Okafor's office on November 14th. She had been at a parent-teacher conference at the school where she taught, sitting across from parents of a 9-year-old named Marcus who was struggling with reading, trying to keep her focus on Marcus's reading while her back ached and her ankles were swollen, and her husband had not come home the previous night. "He fabricated it," she said. Okafor signed a document describing a session that did not happen. The word fabricated sat in the air between them, and she turned it over, examining it. She knew Adrian was capable of maneuvering. She had watched him maneuver professionally for years. The elegant way he managed hospital politics, the way he positioned himself in every room, the small calibrations he made to other people's perceptions of him. She had admired it once. She understood now that it was not a professional skill. It was a character trait that expressed itself wherever he happened to be standing. But this was different from hospital politics. This was a document, a signed document bearing a physician's license. A document submitted to a court that described psychiatric sessions that had never occurred, described a woman's mental state based on conversations that had never happened, and would be used to take her daughter. "Carol needs this," Naomi said. "Carol already has it." She looked up. "You sent it to her?" "This morning, before you came in." "You were already, She stopped. You've been building this since before I woke up. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She sat with that for a moment. The feeling it produced was complicated. Gratitude and something adjacent to unease. The specific unease of understanding that someone has been moving pieces around a board on your behalf without asking permission. She understood why. She understood the strategic logic. She also understood that she was going to need to be very clear, very soon, about the difference between someone helping her and someone managing her, because those two things looked identical from the outside until they didn't. "What's the next move?" she asked. "Okafor," he said. "He's the weakest point in the structure. A fabricated evaluation signed by a licensed psychiatrist. That's not just civil liability. That's criminal. He knows that. Which means when someone makes clear to him that the fabrication has been identified, he'll break." "People like Okafor always break," Dante said, without particular heat. "Just observation, the tone of a man who has seen the inside of a lot of negotiations. They participate in things like this because they're convinced it will never be examined. The moment it is, the cost calculation changes. Who makes that clear to him? Carol can send a formal inquiry. That's the clean version." A pause. "There are other versions." "Use Carol," Naomi said immediately. He looked at her. "I mean it. Whatever else you're doing, the surveillance, the phone records, I understand there are things I'm not going to know the specifics of. Fine. But Okafor is someone I can face in court. I want the clean version." Something in his expression shifted. Not approval exactly. Something that lived next to approval, but was more restrained. "Carol contacts Okafor today," he said. "Today. Today." She exhaled, looked at the closed laptop, then at the window, at the lake, at the flat gray November water that had become, in the space of 3 days, a landscape she associated with something that felt dangerously close to safety. "I need to name her," she said. Dante looked at her. "My daughter, she needs a name." She paused. "I've been calling her the baby, and she's going to develop a complex." The almost smile again. There and then managed. "What are you thinking?" "Vera," she said. "I think I'm thinking Vera." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "That's right." She looked at him. He was looking at the closed laptop, and she understood that he was not looking at the laptop at all. Carol called at 2:17 in the afternoon. Naomi was in the garden. Not really a garden in the winter sense, more a wide stone terrace above the slope that led to the lake. But Rosa had put a chair out there and wrapped Naomi in a blanket and installed her with specific instructions that communicated, across the language barrier, that fresh air was not optional. Little Vera was inside with Elena, sleeping with the concentrated commitment of someone who has decided sleep is the primary occupation. Naomi was watching the lake and not thinking, which was a skill she was developing out of necessity, when the phone rang. "We have a problem," Carol said. Naomi closed her eyes for 1 second. "Okafor?" "Okafor received my inquiry at 11 this morning. By noon, he had called Adrian. By 12:30, he had retained his own attorney." Carol's voice was tight. Not panicked. Carol did not panic. Naomi was coming to understand. But tight in the specific way of someone whose plan has encountered faster resistance than anticipated. "He's not going to cooperate. He signed a fraudulent document." He signed a document. His attorney is already preparing the position that the evaluation was conducted via remote consultation and that the notation was a clerical error regarding the date. It's thin, but it buys time, and time is what they need right now. Naomi pressed her free hand flat against her thigh. Hard. Felt the pressure of her own palm and used it to stay in the conversation instead of following the thing that wanted to happen in her chest. "So Okafor's covered? For now? What about the phone records, the call from Hartwell? I can use them in depositions. I cannot use them in the emergency hearing next week without establishing their provenance, and the provenance is—" A pause that told everything. "The provenance is complicated." Naomi understood. Dante's people had obtained the records in a way that would not survive legal scrutiny. The records were real. The method of obtaining them was not something she could put in front of a judge. "Carol," she said, "what do we actually have that I can use next week?" The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. In Naomi's experience with Carol over the past 48 hours, 4 seconds was a long time for her to be quiet. Right now, Carol said, your testimony. Reyes's medical report documenting your condition when you arrived at Moretti's estate. The bank camera. I have someone pulling that footage today, but we don't have it yet. And the Lockett story, which is compelling, but is not evidence of anything legally actionable. So we have almost nothing. We have the truth. The truth that he submitted a fabricated psychiatric evaluation to a court, which we can assert but cannot currently prove in a way that overrides the document itself. Carol exhaled. I'm not telling you we lose. I'm telling you where we are today, which is not where I want to be the week before a hearing. Things can change. How fast? That depends on factors I don't control. A pause. There's something else. His attorneys filed a supplemental motion this morning. They're requesting that the court evaluator visit your current address within 24 hours instead of 72. They moved the timeline up. Why? Because they know where you are. The terrace was cold. She had not fully registered the cold until this moment. It came in off the lake with the particular indifference of November, moving through the blanket and the wool of her sweater and settling against her skin. He has someone in Dante's house, she said. The sentence came out very flat. That's one possibility. What's the other possibility? That he had someone follow the car the night of the storm. Carol paused. Either way, he knows the address. And he's moved the evaluation up to press you. Either to leave and demonstrate you have nowhere stable to go, or to stay and give his attorneys the ammunition of the environment. Naomi stood up from the chair. The blanket fell. She left it on the stone. Can you delay the evaluation? I filed for an extension. Judge Whitmore may or may not grant it. He's... A careful pause. He's not hostile to us. But he's not warm either. He's a man who does things by procedure, and right now procedure favors the motion that was filed first, which was Adrian's. Yes. She was walking now, not going anywhere, just moving, because the alternative was standing still, and standing still, right now felt like surrender. The terrace ended at a low stone wall above the slope, and she stopped there, hand on the stone, looking down at the lake. The water was the color of pewter. A single bird moved across it, very low, and disappeared into the gray. Carol, she said, if the evaluator comes tomorrow and finds this house, finds what this house is, what happens to Vera? The silence this time was 5 seconds. In the immediate term, nothing. They can't remove an infant from her mother based on an environmental assessment alone, but it hands Adrian's team a narrative that will be very hard to counter for the remainder of the case. Carol's voice was precise. It doesn't end us. It damages us significantly. How significantly? Significantly enough that I want you out of that house before tomorrow morning. Naomi ended the call. She stood at the stone wall with her hand pressing into the rough surface hard enough that the cold of the stone moved into her palm and up through her wrist, and she focused on that, on the specific physical sensation, because it kept the other thing from taking over. The other thing being the exact shape of what was happening, the systematic, careful, well-resourced dismantling of her ability to keep her daughter. She had known he would fight. She had known since the moment she found the email, since the moment she understood that the version of Adrian she had married did not actually exist and had been replaced at some point by this other thing. She had known he would fight, and she had told herself she was ready for that. She had not been ready for how good he was at it. She went back inside. Dante was in the hallway. He had her blanket in his hand. He must have seen it from somewhere, some window overlooking the terrace. He held it out. The evaluator is coming tomorrow, she said. I know, Marco told me. Carol thinks I should leave. He didn't respond immediately. He folded the blanket over the back of a chair in the hallway, a domestic gesture that sat oddly on him and was somehow more revealing than anything he'd said in the study. What do you think? I think if I leave, I'm demonstrating that I don't have stable housing, and if I stay, I'm giving Adrian a weapon. She looked at him. I think someone in your house told him where I was. He went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone who has already suspected something and is now hearing it confirmed. His jaw tightened by the same 2 millimeters she'd noticed in the security guard's face 3 days ago, that involuntary physical response to information that costs something to receive. Who knew you were here? She asked. My household. His voice had changed. Back to the phone call voice, the one that lived under the surface. Reyes, Elena, Marco, 4 others on the overnight staff. Who has a reason to give Adrian information? No one should have a reason. Should isn't the same as does. He looked at her with an expression that acknowledged this without being pleased about it. I'll find out. Before tomorrow. Yes. She studied his face. Is that something you're going to tell me about, or is that another thing I'm being kept at a distance from? A long pause. What would you do with the information? I'd look the person in the eye, she said. That's all. He considered her. Then, I'll tell you before tonight. She nodded. Then, I'm not leaving. I know. I'm making that decision. Not Carol, not you, me. She held his gaze. Vera was born in this house. Whatever this house is, whatever you are, this is where she took her first breath, and I am not going to run from a room my daughter was born in because a man who left me in the rain wants me to. Something passed through his face that she would think about later, in the quiet of the early morning, and not fully understand. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said very quietly, All right. All right, she repeated. She went upstairs to feed her daughter. It was Elena. Dante told her at 6:15 that evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while Rosa moved behind him with pointed, aggressive normalcy, clattering things on the stovetop with the energy of a woman who is furious and has chosen cookware as her outlet. Elena called a number registered to a property management company, Dante said. The company is a shell. The shell connects, after 3 steps, to an LLC that handles personal assets for Adrian Voss. Naomi was sitting at the kitchen table. Vera was in her arms. She looked down at her daughter and then up at Dante. And the thing she felt was not what she expected, not rage, not betrayal in the sharp sense, but something colder and more exhausted. The feeling of watching a door close on the last room you thought was safe. How long? She said. The call was made the morning after you arrived, 6:48 a.m. Before I was awake. Yes. She thought about Elena's hands covering hers during labor. The firm, steady grip of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, which was, it turned out, true in every sense. She thought about Elena handing her the baby. She thought about the 12 years at Northwestern that Dante had mentioned, the reason Elena was on his payroll that he hadn't explained. And she thought, now that she understood the shape of it, that Elena had come to Dante through Adrian somehow, had been a placement rather than a find, patient and invisible, and waiting for something exactly like this. Where is she? Naomi asked. She left this afternoon. I didn't have her stopped. Why not? Because stopping her would have created a different problem. His voice was level. She's already made her call. Stopping her after the fact doesn't undo it. It only makes noise. Naomi looked at him. You knew before you told me. I found out at noon. And you waited until 6. I needed to be certain. He paused. And I needed to make arrangements. What arrangements? Elena isn't the only exposure in this house, he said. There are files here, records, things that have nothing to do with you but that cannot be in a location that's about to receive a court-appointed evaluator. He said it plainly, without apology, as one states a practical reality. I've been moving things since this afternoon. She absorbed this. The house around her, the stone walls, the kitchen, the room where her daughter had been born, had been, in the hours since she'd stood on the terrace, in the process of being quietly sanitized, made safe for scrutiny in a way it had not been before she arrived. She understood, in a way she had intellectually grasped but not felt until now, that Dante's life operated at a constant angle to the legal world, that everything in it was calibrated to exist at that angle, and that her presence here had required an adjustment of that calibration. She had cost him something. The nature of it was not small. Thank you, she said, and meant it without knowing entirely what she was thanking him for. Rosa put a plate in front of her, did not look at Dante, said something in Italian that was clearly directed at him and clearly not a compliment. He answered in Italian. Rosa responded with a sound that communicated her position on the matter without requiring words. She says you should have hired better, Naomi said. Dante looked at her. You understand Italian? I understood that. For the first time, the first actual time, not the controlled almost smile, but the real thing. He laughed. It was brief and it was quiet, and it changed the geography of his face for approximately 3 seconds before he brought it back. But it happened. Rosa pointed at Naomi with a wooden spoon as if to say, "See?" The court evaluator arrived at 9:14 the following morning. Her name was Dr. Susan Pratt, and she was 60, gray-haired, carrying a leather portfolio, and wearing the expression of a woman who has been in a great many rooms and assessed a great many situations and is not easily impressed or alarmed. She introduced herself to Naomi at the door with the brisk efficiency of someone who has a schedule, accepted the offer of coffee, and declined the offer of a tour until she was ready for it. Naomi had been awake since 4. She had fed Vera twice, had showered, had put on the clothes Carol had sent over the previous afternoon, professional but not effortful, the specific register of someone who takes their life seriously without performing it. She had arranged the room where Vera slept so that the space communicated what it was: a mother's room, a baby's room, lived in and cared for and warm. Rosa had made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and had then been gently but firmly asked by Naomi to stay out of sight until the evaluation was over, a request Rosa had received with offended dignity and then complied with. Dante was not in the house. He had left at 7 without fanfare, in a car driven by Marco, and had said only, "Call me when she leaves." Naomi understood this as another form of the calibration. His absence from the house during the evaluation was strategic, a removal of the most obvious liability from the assessor's field of vision. She understood the strategy. She also noticed that the house felt different without him in it, which was a piece of information she set aside for later. Dr. Pratt spent 40 minutes with Naomi before asking to see the rest of the house. She asked about the birth, about Naomi's support network, about her plans for housing and employment, about the circumstances of her marriage and the current legal situation, in the careful, neutral language of someone trained to gather information without telegraphing conclusions. Naomi answered everything directly. She had decided before the woman arrived that she would not perform, would not construct a version of herself designed for the evaluation, but would simply be the version of herself that existed, which was a woman who had made some difficult choices in a very short time, under very difficult circumstances, and was prepared to explain each one. "Can you tell me about your relationship with the homeowner?" Pratt asked, pen poised. "He's someone who helped me in an emergency," Naomi said. "He's not a romantic partner. He's not the father of my daughter. He's a person who stopped his car in a thunderstorm because I was in active labor on hospital steps, and who provided me with medical care and a place to recover while I established my legal situation." Pratt wrote something. "Are you aware of Mr. Moretti's professional reputation?" "I'm aware that he has one." Naomi kept her voice even. "I'm also aware that the alternative to being here was giving birth alone on concrete in the rain, and that the choice between those two things was made for me by my husband, who arranged to have me locked out of the hospital where he has professional privileges." Pratt looked up from her notepad. "I'd like the court to understand that clearly," Naomi said. "I'm not here because I chose a dangerous environment for my daughter. I am here because the only other environment available to me on the night of my daughter's birth was a thunderstorm." Pratt held her gaze for a moment. Then she wrote something and returned to the next question. The tour of the house took 20 minutes. Pratt moved through each room with methodical attention, made notes, asked occasional questions about practical matters: heating, water safety, the sleeping arrangement for the baby. She spent 4 minutes in the room where Vera had been born and now slept, standing in the middle of it and looking at the crib Dante had produced from somewhere on the second day, the mobile above it, the small stack of clean blankets on the dresser, the baby monitor on the nightstand. Naomi stood in the doorway and watched her and breathed. When Pratt left at 11:03, she said she would have her report to the court within 48 hours. She thanked Naomi for her time. She did not say what the report would contain. Carol called at 11:20. "How did it go?" "I don't know," Naomi said. "Honestly." "Did you hold it together?" "Yes." "That's the most important thing?" Carol paused. "I have something. The bank camera footage from Mercy Drive. My investigator pulled it this morning." Naomi went very still. "And?" It shows the hospital entrance clearly. It shows you arriving, climbing the steps, being stopped by security. It shows the duration, 11 minutes on the steps before you collapsed. A pause. It also shows the lobby through the glass doors. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough for what? Enough to see a man in a white coat standing near the security desk at 9:51 p.m. My investigator pulled the hospital's published physician directory. The build is consistent with Adrian, Naomi said. We can't confirm identity from the footage alone, but we can establish that a physician was present near the security station at the time you were being denied entry. Carol's voice had changed. The tightness was still there, but underneath it something else was moving, something that sounded like momentum. I'm filing a motion to subpoena the hospital's internal communication records for that night. Phone logs, security directives, anything transmitted through their system between 9 and 11 p.m. They'll fight it. Of course they'll fight it, but fighting it looks bad. Fighting a subpoena for records related to a pregnant woman being denied emergency care looks very bad in front of a judge, and I intend to make sure Judge Whitmore understands exactly how bad it looks. Naomi exhaled. For the first time in 4 days, the exhale went all the way down. Carol, she said, are we going to win this? A pause. I'm going to try very hard to make sure we do. That's not an answer. No, Carol agreed. It's not. I'll have a better one for you by Friday. The call ended. Naomi sat in the quiet of the house. Vera asleep, Rosa somewhere distant and fragrant with lunch preparations, the lake visible through the window in a strip of silver gray, and let herself feel for exactly 60 seconds the particular combination of terror and defiance that had become her baseline emotional register in the past 4 days. She felt it fully. Then she picked up the phone and called Dante. The evaluator left, she said when he answered. How was it? Survivable. She paused. Carol has the bank footage. She's filing the subpoena. A brief silence. That's good. Yes. She looked at the window. There's something I need to ask you. Ask. The internal hospital records, the ones Carol is subpoenaing. She paused, choosing the words. If they've already been moved or altered or in any way adjusted before that subpoena lands, the subpoena becomes worthless. Silence. I need to know, she said carefully, that you haven't already been inside those systems. The pause on his end was 4 seconds. 5. Dante. The subpoena will find what it needs to find, he said. She felt the bottom shift. Not drop. Shift, like the ground settling into a new position. That's not an answer. It's the answer I can give you. She stared at the lake, the strip of silver gray in the window. A long time passed, maybe 6 seconds, maybe 10, while she sat with the specific weight of what he had just told her without telling her. He had been inside the hospital systems. He had been inside them, and whatever he had found there, or whatever he had ensured would be there to be found, was now waiting for Carol's subpoena like a gift that could not be acknowledged as a gift. She thought about the locket, about the debt he'd described, about 22 years of a man waiting to repay something to a woman who was dead and finding her granddaughter in the rain instead. She thought about what she'd said on the terrace. I am not going to be a person things happen to anymore. She thought about what it meant that the thing she'd told herself she would not be had already happened, was already in motion, was already done, and irreversible, and built into the foundation of her case before she'd had the conversation about it. You should have told me, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes, he said. And the single word carried something in it. Not guilt exactly, because she was not sure guilt was in his register, but something adjacent. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who knew the line he crossed and crossed it anyway and is prepared to own that. If this comes out, it won't. If it does, Naomi. His voice had something in it she had not heard before. If it comes out on me. Not on you. Not on Carol. Everything that was done, I did. You knew nothing. A pause. That part is actually true. She pressed her palm against the table, the stone underneath, the cold of it moving up through her hand. That's not the point. I know. The point is that I needed to be part of this. I needed to make the choices about what we do and what we don't do, and what lines we cross and don't cross, because she's my daughter. This is my life. Her voice held steady, barely. You took that from me. The silence on his end was the longest yet. You're right, he said. Just that. Not qualified. Not softened. She closed her eyes, opened them. The lake was the same color it had been this morning and would be tomorrow. That flat, persistent silver gray that didn't ask anything of you, that simply was, indifferent to what happened on its shore. I need you to promise me, she said. From here forward, nothing happens without me knowing. Nothing. I promise. She believed him. She wasn't certain she should, but she did. She was still sitting at the table when Carol called back 40 minutes later, and the quality of Carol's voice in the first half-second told her that something had changed. Not the tight, controlled tone of someone managing difficulty. Something else. Something that had the particular texture of a situation accelerating past the speed at which it can be managed. They moved the hearing, Carol said. To when? 4 days from now, Thursday morning. Judge Whitmore's clerk called 20 minutes ago. A pause. Adrian petitioned for an expedited hearing on the grounds that the infant is being kept in an unsuitable environment and every additional day represents ongoing risk. He used the evaluation. He used the evaluation before we have the results of the evaluation. Carol's voice had an edge in it that Naomi had not heard before. Not panic, but something closer to it than anything she'd expressed in 4 days. Which means he has a source inside Pratt's office or inside the court clerk's office. Someone told him what Pratt found before the report was filed. Naomi stood up from the table. Can you be ready in 4 days? I have to be. A pause. But Naomi, there's something else. Something his attorneys filed with the expedited petition. The edge in Carol's voice sharpened. They have a witness. Someone who claims to have seen you in the weeks before the birth, behaving erratically in public, shouting, crying in the street, behavior consistent with the psychiatric evaluation Okafor filed. That's not true. I know that. I was not... She stopped. Thought back through the past months, through every public moment, every place she'd been. I cried once, on the platform at the Belmont L stop. I was 7 months pregnant, and I'd just had a phone call with my mother, and I cried for about 2 minutes waiting for the train. There was a man on the platform. Carol was very quiet. He was reading something on his phone, Naomi said. The memory came back with the specific clarity of things you don't know you've stored until you need them. He glanced at me a couple of times. He had on a blue parka. She stopped. What? He took a photograph, she said. I thought he was just using his phone, but he pointed it at me. Her voice went flat. He was documenting it. Carol didn't speak for 2 seconds. When she did, her voice was precise and cold in a way Naomi had not heard from her before. Adrian staged a witness, positioned someone to document you in a vulnerable moment, and is now presenting that documentation as evidence of instability. How long has he been planning this? At minimum, since you were 7 months pregnant. A pause. Possibly longer. Naomi stood in the kitchen of a house that wasn't hers, in a city that had spent the past week demonstrating its indifference to her survival, holding a phone against her ear and understanding, fully, without buffer, without the capacity to soften it, that the man she had married had spent the better part of a year building a cage around her, methodically, patiently, with the specific surgical precision of someone who practices cutting for a living and understands that the most effective cuts are the ones you don't feel until long after they've been made. She thought about the locket around her throat, about her grandmother, Vera, who had stopped for a stranger in the dark because it was the right thing and had expected nothing back, about a woman who had understood, in the moment it mattered, that you don't calculate the cost of doing what's necessary. You just do it and settle the account later. She thought about her daughter sleeping upstairs in a crib in a stranger's house, her small fist pressed against her cheek, her perfect unreasonable grip. She thought about Adrian standing in the lobby of his hospital in his white coat in front of a camera, composed, authoritative, perfectly lit. And something in Naomi Mercer, something that had been running, that had been absorbing blows and calculating retreats and managing the terror of a woman who had been made small, stopped running. It did not turn around slowly. It stopped and turned in one motion. "Carol," she said. Her voice was different. She could hear that it was different, and she didn't try to adjust it. "I want to be in that courtroom on Thursday. You will be. I want to testify, not just sit there. I want to take the stand." A pause. "That opens you up to cross-examination. His attorneys will. I know what they'll do." She looked out at the lake, the silver-gray water. "Let them. I am done being a person. Things are done too. I am going to sit in front of that judge, and I am going to tell him exactly what happened on the night my daughter was born, and I am going to tell him about the photograph on the L platform, and I am going to tell him about Philip Okafor and the evaluation that was fabricated for sessions that never occurred, and I am going to look at Adrian Voss across a courtroom and make him explain every single one of those things out loud, in public, on the record." Carol was quiet for 3 full seconds. "All right," she said. "Then we have 4 days to make sure you're the most credible witness that courtroom has ever seen." "Good," Naomi said. "Start tonight." She ended the call. She stood for a moment with the phone in her hand in the quiet kitchen, with the lake outside and Rosa's lunch somewhere fragrant and distant, and Vera sleeping upstairs with her impossible grip and her grandmother's name waiting to be given to her properly in a world that would be safer than this one by the time she was old enough to ask about it. Then she heard a sound from the hallway, footsteps, and then a pause, and she knew without looking that Dante was back, that he was standing in the doorway in his preferred position, watching her stand in the middle of the kitchen with a phone in her hand and a look on her face that she could feel must be something he hadn't seen from her before. She turned. He was in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had spent the better part of 3 days trying to read, and then he said, "You've decided something." "Yes?" she said. "Tell me." "Thursday," she said. 4 days. "And I need everything you have. Everything. Because I'm going to walk into that courtroom and I'm going to end this." She paused. "But I need to know right now if there's anything else you've done that I don't know about. Anything that could surface in that room and surprise me. Because I cannot be surprised in that room." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down." And the way he said it told her that what was coming was going to change the shape of everything again. That the thing she thought she understood about the fight she was in was about to become something larger and darker and more dangerous than she had built her courage around. And that she was going to need every version of herself she had ever been to survive what came next in that distinguish from the real thing once you were close enough to see it clearly. Okafor exhaled through his nose. "The date," he said slowly, "may have been recorded in error." "In error," Carol repeated. Not a question. A surface she was letting him hear the hollowness of. "A clerical, Dr. Okafor." Carol's voice dropped half a register. "Did you conduct a clinical session with Naomi Mercer on November 14th? The pause lasted 4 seconds. "No," Okafor said. "I did not." The courtroom erupted. The courtroom did not go quiet after that. It went loud in the specific way that rooms go loud when the thing everyone has been pretending might not be true turns out to be true. Not the noise of surprise, but the noise of confirmation, which is louder because it carries the weight of everything that was already suspected but unspoken. Whitmore's gavel came down 3 times before the sound contracted back to something manageable. And in those 3 seconds, Naomi sat completely still at the respondent's table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her and watched the ceiling and breathed. Galveston was on his feet. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess." "Sit down, Mr. Galveston." Whitmore's voice had not raised in volume, but had acquired a quality that made the room respond to it the way rooms respond to a temperature drop, immediately and without argument. "You'll have an opportunity to redirect. Right now I'm going to hear from this witness." He looked at Okafor over the reading glasses. "Dr. Okafor, you just testified under oath that you did not conduct a clinical session with the respondent on the date indicated in the evaluation you submitted to this court." "That's correct, Your Honor." "Then can you explain to me how that document came to exist?" Okafor's hands on the railing were no longer still. They had developed a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, the kind produced not by age, but by the body's understanding of its own situation. He was a man standing in an open field watching a storm arrive from every direction simultaneously, and the calculation he was making in real time was visible in the way his eyes moved. To Galveston, to the document in front of him, to some middle distance that wasn't the courtroom at all. The evaluation, Okafor said carefully, was prepared at the request of Dr. Voss. It was based on... He stopped, started again. It was based on information provided to me by Dr. Voss regarding his wife's behavior and mental state. I did not conduct a direct session. The document should have reflected that more clearly. It doesn't reflect that at all, Whitmore said. It presents itself as a clinical evaluation conducted with the patient present. I understand that. Do you understand that submitting a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation to a family court is a criminal matter? The word criminal moved through the room like a current through water, invisible, immediate, felt by everything it passed through. Okafor's attorney, seated in the gallery, was on his feet. Galveston's junior attorney was writing something very fast. Adrian, at the petitioner's table, was looking at his own hands. I think, Okafor said, in the voice of a man who has just made a decision about which direction to fall, I should speak with my attorney before continuing. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man who has heard this sentence many times and finds it neither surprising nor acceptable but is procedurally obligated to honor it. We'll recess for 20 minutes, he said. When we return, Mr. Galveston, I'm going to need you to explain to me how a fabricated psychiatric document came to be filed as a primary exhibit in your client's motion. He looked at Adrian directly. And Dr. Voss, I'd strongly suggest you use those 20 minutes to have a conversation with your legal team. The gavel came down. The recess had the quality of a held breath. Naomi stood in the hallway outside the courtroom with Carol and did not speak for the first 30 seconds. She stood with her back against the wall and her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance and processed what had just happened in the room, the way you process something that is simultaneously exactly what you hoped for and nothing like what you imagined it would feel like. That's not over, she said finally. No, Carol agreed. But the shape of it has changed. Galveston is going to regroup. He's going to find another angle. Yes, but Okafor just admitted on the record that the evaluation was fabricated at Adrian's request. That's in the transcript now. It doesn't come out of the transcript. Naomi looked at her. Can Whitmore throw out Adrian's motion on the basis of what just happened? He can, whether he does today or takes it under advisement. Carol paused. He's careful. He's going to want to hear everything before he rules. But what he just watched happen to his exhibit framework is going to color everything Galveston says for the rest of the morning. At the far end of the hallway, the door to a conference room opened and Galveston stepped out, followed by his junior attorney, followed by Adrian. Adrian had his phone in his hand. He was speaking quietly and rapidly into it. He looked up once, the length of the hallway, straight at Naomi, and then looked away. She watched him look away. She noted the speed of it. She noted that for the first time in the 4 years she had known this man, he was the one who broke eye contact first. She noted that and filed it, Carol's hand on her arm. There's something else, she said lower. Dante's being called when we go back in. I'm calling him as a witness. I know. Well, his testimony about the 3 approaches, if Whitmore allows it, it establishes a pattern of conduct that dismantles the character foundation Galveston has been building. But Galveston will cross-examine hard. He'll try to make Dante's history the story. Dante knows that. Are you sure he's ready for what that looks like? In that room, in public. Carol. Naomi looked at her. He drove me here this morning. He's been in that building for 2 hours. Ask him yourself if you need to, but don't ask me to answer for him. She paused. He'll hold. Carol studied her for a moment in the way she studied things. Efficiently, completely. Then she nodded. They went back in. Whitmore wasted no time. He allowed Carol's motion to enter the documentation of Adrian's 3 approaches to Dante into the record over Galveston's sustained and detailed objection, which Whitmore heard fully and overruled with the brevity of a man who has made up his mind and doesn't need to perform the deliberation. Galveston's objection was noted. The documentation was entered. Then Carol called Dante Moretti to the stand. He came in from the hallway door. He walked to the stand the way he walked everywhere, without hurry, without performance, at the particular pace of a man who has decided what he's doing and is doing it. He wore the dark suit. He took the oath in a voice that was level and clear, and he sat. And he looked at Carol, and he waited. He did not look at Adrian. Carol walked him through it carefully. The first approach, 12 years ago. The second, 9 years ago. The third, 7 years ago. The one that had been recorded. The one in which Adrian Voss had sat in Dante's office and described a scheme involving the manipulation of terminal patients' estate documents, and had asked for introductions to people who could facilitate the movement of the resulting assets. Carol entered the recording into evidence. A court officer set up the playback device. The room listened. Adrian's voice, 7 years younger, came through the speaker with the specific quality of recorded audio, slightly flattened, slightly distant, but unmistakably him. Unmistakably his cadence, his precision, the way he constructed a sentence so that it said what it meant while appearing to say something adjacent to it. Naomi had lived with that voice for 4 years. She recognized every calibration of it. The room was silent for the duration of the recording. Whitmore listened with his hands folded on the bench and his glasses on his nose and his face in the expression of a man receiving information and doing nothing with it yet, holding it in suspension while the full picture assembled. When it ended, the silence lasted several more seconds. Then Galveston rose for cross-examination, and he was, as Carol had said, very good. He went after Dante with the methodical precision of a surgeon. The criminal history, the nature of Dante's business interests, the question of why a man with Dante's profile had kept a recording of this conversation for 7 years without bringing it to law enforcement, the suggestion that the recording could have been fabricated or edited, the implication that Dante's involvement in Naomi's situation was motivated by something other than the altruistic debt repayment Carol had introduced. Dante answered every question in the same register: level, direct, without defensiveness, and without performance. When Galveston suggested the recording was fabricated, Dante described its provenance and the technical verification Carol had obtained in precise terms without raising his voice. When Galveston asked why he hadn't gone to law enforcement 7 years ago, Dante said, "Because Dr. Voss backed down when I told him to. I documented it in case he didn't stay back down. He didn't." When Galveston asked what his interest was in the respondent's custody case, Dante looked at him and said, "Her grandmother saved my sister's life. She did it without asking anything in return. Her grandmother is dead. This is what I have to offer instead." Galveston paused, just barely, 1 beat too long. He sat down. Whitmore looked at the room over his glasses. Then he said he would hear closing arguments after a lunch recess, and he would issue his ruling from the bench this afternoon. Naomi ate nothing at lunch. Carol ate a sandwich at the table in the conference room they'd been given, working through documents while she chewed, and didn't comment on the untouched food. Dante sat in the corner of the room with a cup of coffee and his phone and was quiet, which was his natural condition and which Naomi had come to understand as a form of consideration. The quietness of someone who knows when filling space costs more than leaving it empty. "He's going to lose," Naomi said. Not a question. Carol looked up. "The motion?" "Yes." Whitmore's face when the recording played. She set the sandwich down. "He's going to deny the emergency motion, and he's going to refer Okafor's testimony to the state medical board and possibly the DA. And the custody case? The full case? That's a separate proceeding, but today's hearing just destroyed the evidentiary foundation they were going to build the full case on. Fabricated psychiatric evaluation, documented history of criminal solicitation, footage showing Adrian present at the security station while you were denied emergency care. Carol looked at her directly. He could fight. Expensive attorneys can fight anything. But what he's fighting with just got significantly smaller. "Would he?" Naomi asked. "Keep fighting?" Carol picked up the sandwich again. "That depends on what else surfaces. The DA's involvement changes the calculation for him. A criminal investigation means his attorney's first priority becomes keeping him out of a cell, not winning a custody dispute." A pause. "My read is that by the end of next week, his legal team is going to be advising him to settle." He won't want to settle. No, but he'll want to stay licensed and out of criminal jeopardy more than he'll want to fight a case he can no longer win. Naomi looked at the untouched food in front of her. Then she picked up the fork. The afternoon session was shorter than the morning. Galveston argued. He was disciplined and he was skilled, and he built the best structure available to him from the materials that remained after the morning, which were considerably fewer than the morning had begun with. He emphasized the question of environment, Dante's house, Dante's history, Naomi's choice of refuge. He was careful not to mention the recording. He was careful not to mention Okafor. He argued what he could argue. Carol argued last. She was brief. She showed the camera footage one more time. She quoted the timestamp of Hartwell's call. She said, in the flat, clear voice of someone who knows the sentence doesn't need decoration, a woman in active labor was denied emergency medical treatment in a thunderstorm by a security guard acting on instructions from the petitioner. She survived because a stranger stopped his car. The petitioner then filed an emergency custody motion citing concerns about that stranger's character. The court should consider carefully which person in this proceeding has demonstrated a willingness to risk an infant's life for the sake of legal strategy. She sat down. Whitmore ruled 40 minutes later. He denied the emergency motion in its entirety. He issued an immediate lifting of the travel restriction on the infant. He referred the matter of the fabricated psychiatric evaluation to the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation and to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for review. He ordered Mercy General to produce all internal communications related to the night of November 22nd, Vera's birth night, in response to Carol's outstanding subpoena. And he issued a notation in the record that the petitioner's legal team had introduced into evidence a document later demonstrated to be fraudulent, which notation would attach to the full custody proceeding. He said all of this in the same procedural register he'd used all morning, not warm, not hostile, just precise. And then he closed his folder and left the bench. Adrian's chair scraped back. Naomi heard it, but did not turn around. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and let the ruling settle into her body the way warmth settles into cold. Slowly, from the outside in, not all at once. Carol's hand on her arm. That's as good as it gets today. I know. She exhaled, fully, all the way down. I know. She stood, turned. Adrian was still there. Galveston was packing documents with the efficient speed of a man who is already thinking about the next thing, already calculating the retreat, already making the tactical adjustments that a man in his profession makes without sentiment. The junior attorney was on her phone. Adrian was standing with his jacket in one hand and his phone in the other, and he was looking at Naomi, not with the smile from the morning, not with the composure. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, and it took her a moment to identify it because she had never had occasion to see it in 4 years of marriage. It was the expression of a man who has just understood, in real time, that the thing he built is not going to hold. Not the panic of it. He was too controlled for that. But the moment just before, when the structure is still standing, but the ground under it has already shifted, and the standing is a temporary condition. She held his gaze. She had imagined this moment in the long nights of the past week in various forms. She had imagined saying something. She had imagined the right sentence, the one that carried the full weight of everything, that said all of it in a form he couldn't dismiss or reframe or turn into evidence of her instability. She had rehearsed versions of it. She said nothing. She looked at him for 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to be efficient, and then she picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Dante was in the hallway. He had been there since his testimony, as far as she knew, just there, in the specific way he was in spaces, present without requiring acknowledgement. He looked at her when she came through the door and read her face with the rapid accuracy she had come to expect from him. "Done," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked out of the building into the November afternoon, which had gone cold and sharp and pale, the sky a flat white that meant snow somewhere to the north moving south. Carol was behind them on the phone already. Marco materialized with the car. The stone steps of the courthouse were wet from an earlier drizzle, and Naomi came down them carefully, one hand on the rail, and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street. Chicago moved around her the way it always moved, without adjustment, without acknowledgement, the city's permanent and indifferent forward momentum. Cabs and pedestrians and a delivery truck blocking the right lane, and someone's music leaking out of a car window 2 intersections over. The city had not paused for the week she had spent inside the machinery of it. It would not pause now. She felt standing there a specific and unexpected sensation that she would not fully name for several days, but that lived somewhere between grief and relief. The feeling of a long tension releasing, which is not simple or clean, but is complex. The way the aftermath of physical exertion is complex. The body taking inventory of what it spent and finding the bill higher than expected and settling it anyway. She was going to be okay. She knew that now. Not in the aspirational sense of a thing she was telling herself, but in the factual sense of something she could see the shape of. So was Vera. They drove back to the estate in a silence that was different from the silence of the drive to the courthouse. That silence had been compressed, preparatory, full of the held breath of what was coming. The silence had space in it, room to move around in. Rosa had lunch on the table when they arrived. She had known, somehow, or had simply decided that lunch would be on the table regardless of outcome, which was perhaps the same thing. She embraced Naomi at the door with a fierceness that had nothing performative in it and said something in Italian that Naomi understood completely without understanding a word of it. Vera was awake in the portable crib in the corner of the kitchen. She had been doing something with her hands, the focused, repetitive motion of a baby discovering that her hands belonged to her, and she stopped when Naomi came in and looked at her with the dark, unfocused gaze that was becoming day by day slightly more focused, slightly more specific, slightly more like the gaze of a person who is assembling her understanding of the world. Naomi picked her up, pressed her against her chest, felt the weight of her, the specific, absolute, unreasonable weight of 7 pounds that had become, in the space of a week, the fixed point around which everything else organized. "Hi," she said softly. "We won today." Vera made a sound, not language yet, something preceding language, the impulse toward it, the shape of the intention, the breath that will someday carry words. It was enough. The weeks that followed had their own texture, different from the week of the hearing, different from the storm-soaked night at the beginning of it. The acute crisis had passed, and what replaced it was not peace exactly, but the demanding incremental work of reconstruction, which is less dramatic and more exhausting than crisis in its particular way. Carol filed the full response to the custody case. The Cook County State's attorney opened an investigation into Okafor's fraudulent filing. The medical board opened a parallel proceeding. Mercy General's internal communications, produced under Whitmore's subpoena, included a chain of emails between Adrian and the hospital's legal department dated 3 weeks before Vera's birth that contained, among other things, a detailed discussion of how to handle the situation if his wife arrived at the emergency entrance during labor. The phrase used was contingency management, which was the kind of language that sounds administrative until you put it next to camera footage of a pregnant woman collapsing on steps in the rain, and then it sounds like something else entirely. Hartwell resigned from Mercy General in the second week of December, citing personal reasons, retaining her own criminal attorney 48 hours later. The resignation was reported in the Tribune with 3 paragraphs, as hospital administrative departures typically are. The reason behind it was not in those 3 paragraphs. Naomi read the article on her phone in the kitchen of the estate and set the phone face down and poured herself coffee and said nothing to anyone about it, because there was nothing to say that the fact didn't already say. Adrian's attorneys contacted Carol in the 3rd week of December. They wanted to talk about settlement. Carol called Naomi and told her this in the flat, precise tone she used for information that didn't yet have a verdict attached. "They're going to offer a consent agreement on custody," she said. "Supervised visitation, conditional. No parental custody rights pending resolution of the criminal investigation." He gives up the custody fight. In exchange for... Carol paused. "They're going to ask that you agree not to participate in the state's attorney's investigation as a voluntary witness." Naomi was silent for a moment. "They want me to stay out of the criminal case." "Yes." "That's not my decision to make," she said. "The investigation isn't mine to trade away." "I know. That's what I told them." "Tell them again." A pause. "If you don't take the deal, The custody case continues. Full trial. It could take another 6 months. Tell them again, Naomi said. The deal did not happen. The offer was withdrawn 3 days later when the state's attorney's office indicated it was proceeding regardless of Naomi's participation. Adrian's legal situation had acquired its own momentum by then, fed by sources that had nothing to do with Naomi, hospital employees who had received subpoenas and discovered that institutional loyalty was a rapidly depreciating asset when criminal liability was the alternative currency. The contingency management emails. A second recording, produced by a hospital administrator named Chen, who had been present in a meeting 6 months earlier and had kept her own notes, describing a conversation in which Adrian had outlined the psychiatric documentation strategy in terms that were, in Chen's word to the state's attorney, deliberate. The custody case concluded in February. Not with a trial. With a ruling. Whitmore presided. He had read everything, Kim. Carol had made sure of that. Had made the reading of it unavoidable. Had built the record into something that could not be surveyed quickly. He ruled on a Tuesday morning with the same procedural efficiency he brought to everything, and the ruling was complete. Full legal and physical custody of Vera Mercer to Naomi Mercer. No visitation rights pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. A finding that the petitioner had engaged in a pattern of deliberate legal misconduct in the filing and prosecution of the emergency motion. It was not a soft ruling. Whitmore did not soften things. Naomi was in the courtroom for it. She sat at the respondent's table with Carol beside her, and she listened to each element of the ruling land in sequence, and she did not cry, which surprised her a little, because she had expected to. Instead, she felt something more like recognition, the feeling of a shape becoming visible that had been there all along, underneath everything, waiting for the surface conditions to change. After, in the hallway, Carol shook her hand. Not the professional handshake of a transaction, concluded but something slightly different. Both hands, briefly, the grip of one person acknowledging what another person went through to arrive at the same destination. It's not over, Carol said. The criminal case runs separately. You'll be deposed. I know. And the divorce proceedings are, I know, Naomi said. I know all of it. She looked at Carol. Thank you. I know that's insufficient. It's sufficient, Carol said. Go home. Home. The word had a different geography than it had 2 months ago. She drove herself. She had a car now, leased, a practical thing Carol had helped her sort out in January, one of the 50 practical things that had been sorted out in January while the legal proceedings ground forward. She drove north along the lake on a February afternoon that was cold enough to have turned the shallows to a thin gray ice at the edges and left the deeper water dark and open. The city passed on her left, then thinned, then gave way to the quieter corridor of the northern suburbs, and she turned onto the familiar gravel drive and went through the gate that opened without her slowing. She had not moved out of the estate. This had been a decision that had required several conversations, and one longer one. And it had not been simple in the way that no honest thing is ever actually simple, but it had been arrived at clearly and held. She was not staying because of the legal case. Whitmore's evaluation report had ultimately characterized the environment as stable, suitable, and demonstrably safer than the alternative the petitioner had initially proposed, which had been satisfying in a way Naomi had allowed herself to feel for approximately 10 minutes before moving on. She was not staying because of debt or obligation, or because the locket around her throat created some accounting she was trying to settle. She was staying because Vera had been born here, because Rosa existed here, because the lake outside the window in the morning had become, without her deciding it would, the view she organized her days around, because the man who lived here had walked into a courtroom and sat in a witness chair in public and said, in front of a judge and opposing counsel and a court reporter, her grandmother saved my sister's life. She did it without asking anything in return. She parked in the drive, sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the distant sound of the lake. Then she went inside. Rosa was in the kitchen. Vera was in the high chair. She had graduated to the high chair 2 weeks ago, a development Rosa had treated as an occasion requiring the preparation of specific foods and a great deal of commentary. She was working on something with her hands the way she was always working on something with her hands, this week's project being a wooden ring that she picked up, transferred between hands, examined, dropped, and repeated with the focused methodology of someone conducting a scientific inquiry. She looked up when Naomi came in. The dark eyes, more focused now, more specific, accumulating personhood day by day with the quiet industry of someone who has a great deal of ground to cover and is going about it without fuss. Naomi crouched down in front of the high chair. "We won," she said. "Both of us." Vera looked at her, dropped the wooden ring, extended both hands outward in the gesture that had recently emerged and that meant, in the language that existed before language, "You, come here. Now." Naomi picked her up. Rosa made a sound of satisfaction and turned back to the stove, because the occasion clearly called for food, and she was not a woman who let an occasion pass without a response. Dante was at the window. He had come in from the study at some point. She had not heard him. She rarely heard him move through the house. He existed in it with the particular quietness of someone who has inhabited a space long enough to move through it without disturbing it. He stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and looked at the lake and did not perform any reaction to her arrival, which was, she had come to understand, not indifference but its opposite, the restraint of someone who is paying very close attention and choosing what to do with it. "It's done," she said. "I know, Carol called." She shifted Vera against her hip. The baby had found the collar of her coat and was examining it with the same focused inquiry she brought to the wooden ring. "You should have been there." "No," he said. "I shouldn't have." He turned from the window. "That room was yours. Today, specifically." She looked at him. He was right, which she'd known before she said it and had said it anyway, because there were things you said even when you knew the answer, because saying them was a different act than asking them. "The investigation is going to go on for a long time," she said. "The deposition, the state's attorney, I know." "You're going to be in it?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "How much is that going to cost you?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not dismissing it, not reassuring her away from it. "Some things," he said, "some things that can be managed, some that can't." A pause. "Nothing I wasn't prepared to spend." "You should have told me that before you spent it." "I know." The same acknowledgement he'd given her in the kitchen weeks ago, clean, unqualified, without the addendum of self-defense. "I'm working on the timing." She almost smiled. "Work faster." The almost smile back. There and then held. Vera made a sound, urgent, communicative, aimed at Dante with the unsubtle directness of someone who has decided that available adults are a resource to be fully utilized. She extended one hand toward him in the imperious gesture she had recently developed. He crossed the kitchen, took the small hand in his, the grip of it closing around two of his fingers with that unreasonable strength, the grip that said, "I am here and I am not letting go. I am..." He looked at her with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Naomi had ever seen on his face, stripped of all the management and the levelness and the controlled almost smile. Just a man looking at a child who has decided to hold his hand and finding, in that small transaction, something that reached past the long architecture of who he had become and touched something older. He looked up and found Naomi watching him. Neither of them said anything. Rosa put plates on the table with the decisive energy of someone closing a discussion, because in Rosa's view, the appropriate response to most situations was a hot meal, and she had never been persuaded otherwise and saw no reason to start now. They sat down. Outside the kitchen window, the lake moved in its slow, continuous way, the February light low and pale across the water, the ice at the edges holding, the deeper water open and dark and going about its ancient indifferent business. A thin snow had begun. Not the dramatic snow of the night Vera was born, but a quiet snow, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply begins and continues and covers things gradually until the world looks like something that has been given a second chance at being itself. Vera sat between them in the high chair and conducted her ongoing investigation of the wooden ring, which had been retrieved and returned to her. Rosa talked. Neither Naomi nor Dante understood her, and neither of them needed to. The sound of her was sufficient, the sound of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the meal in front of you is what there is, and that what there is, on balance, enough. Naomi ate. The food was warm. The room was warm. Her daughter was within arm's reach conducting science, oblivious and complete. After dinner, she stood at the window for a long time, looking at the snow coming down over the lake. Dante came to stand beside her. Not in the doorway this time, not at the threshold, but beside her, at the window, looking at the same water. 6 inches between them. The distance of people who have not yet decided what distance means, but are no longer pretending the distance isn't a decision. She's going to ask about all of this someday, Naomi said, when she's old enough. Yes. What do we tell her? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lake, at the snow on it, which was disappearing as it hit the open water, each flake extinguishing itself in the dark surface, giving itself to the thing larger than itself, without remainder. We tell her what happened, he said. Her great-grandmother stopped for a stranger in the dark. The stranger's family stopped for her, and everyone who came after was connected by that. He paused. That's the whole story. Naomi looked at the water. That makes it sound simple. It was simple, he said. The rest of it was just what happened on the way. She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the lake, and in the dim light of the kitchen behind them, his profile had the quality of something that had endured, not unmarked, not unchanged, but continuous, still itself, still standing. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their hands, then at her. He did not say anything. Neither did she. There was nothing to say that the gesture didn't say more cleanly, and they were both people who had learned at significant cost the value of not talking past the thing that was actually happening. Behind them, Rosa made a sound of deep and unsurprised approval and busied herself with the dishes. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the lake in the quiet, purposeful way of things that do not require witness to proceed, covering the stone terrace, settling on the bare branches of the oaks along the drive, filling the small footprints Naomi had left in the garden that afternoon, smoothing them, returning the surface to something unmarked and new. Inside, Vera dropped the wooden ring for the 14th time, looked at it on the tray in front of her with an expression of profound philosophical consideration, and then looked up at the room around her. At Rosa at the sink, at the window and the snow, at the 2 people standing at the glass with their hands together, and made a sound that was warm and complete and entirely itself. The world she had been born into was not a safe world. It had not been safe the night of the thunderstorm, or in the courtroom, or in any of the spaces between, but she was in it, and she was held, and the people around her had paid the price of that in full. Naomi turned from the window. She picked up her daughter. She held her against her chest in the warm kitchen with the snow outside and the lake beyond it, and the long, complicated, unglamorous, genuine work of the future waiting. Not perfect, not promised, not without its own costs and its own weather. And she breathed, in through the nose, all the way down, out.